I wanted to do a short video on a topic that a viewer brought up having to do with the difference between variable transformers and isolation transformers or variable isolation transformers. And the reason I wanted to do a video is, while I responded to this viewer's comment in which he points out that many transformers on the market, including some with the trade name Variac, are not isolation transformers. And so while I have pointed out in many of my videos the differences between these, I thought it might be a good idea to have one video on why that non-isolation transformers are so dangerous, and you really should avoid them. Now, let me first show you what I'm talking about. Over here is a variable auto transformer, and I'll show you the circuits of these in a little bit. This unit, that is the unit here, has the ability to vary the AC voltage up to about 135 or maybe 140 volts. But it does not provide isolation. In other words, the output, which is here, is not isolated from the input line. So if you have a piece of equipment plugged into this unit, whether you understand or not, you are not isolated from the AC line. If you get between that equipment and a ground, you can be killed. And based on my study of the Variac website, and understand Variac is not a generic term, it's a registered trademark for a particular brand. This is not a Variac. It is a variable auto transformer. In fact, it is sold under the name Tenma. But Variacs, based on my study of their website, are all auto transformers. In other words, they are not isolated. Now, one reason that this all came up is because I showed a DIY capacitor tester in which I was using a transformer like this. Now, these also are not necessarily trustworthy because many, if not almost all of these, are actually auto transformers. Once again, I'll show you the circuit in a little bit. This steps up 110 volts on this side to 220 volts on this side so that you can operate, for example, a European shaver or a low wattage appliance on American AC current. In other words, 110 volts, 120 volts. Once again, these are not isolated. The unit that you see here is made by the same company that made, or sold at least, by the same company that sells that auto transformer there that is not isolated, but this one is isolated. Notice that it says that very clearly right up here. And in general, if it does have isolation, it'll say that on the unit. Now, this is a unit that I used to use, and it does provide isolation. The unit that I'm currently using, not because there's anything wrong with that, but because it provides one additional feature, is the Syncor PR57, which is also isolated. Notice it says that right there. So if you are using something that does not have the word isolation in it, or you're just unsure about what you do have or don't have, do not trust it to be an isolation transformer. Now, why does that make a difference? Well, the reason is that without isolation, you literally cannot put your hands on a piece of vintage equipment. Actually, I would recommend you not put your hands on any piece of equipment because there could be shorts or leakage or other things unless it's plugged into an isolation transformer. Now let me show you the circuit differences. On the left is the schematic of an auto transformer. The difference, or the reason it's called an auto transformer, is the input line and the output line are off the same transformer winding. Because of transformer action, if you run this slider, which is the variable part, all the way to the top, you actually get more voltage out than you're putting in. But you're still directly connected from the AC line to the output. So any equipment plugged in here is not isolated. And I wrote it down here, danger, because anytime you're using an auto transformer, whether it's a unit like this unit or a non-isolated Variac brand auto transformer, or a unit like this that isn't labeled one way or the other, you cannot depend on it being isolated. If it's an isolated transformer, then it will look like this unit over here. This is a variable isolation transformer. Notice that the AC line plugs into the primary. The only connection between the primary and the secondary is the magnetic fields that come through the core. No electrical connection from this side to this side, only magnetic. And on the secondary side, you can have this variation, which can give you a greater voltage than the input. In fact, if the step-up ratio is right, this can be a large amount. This can be as much as 400 or 500 volts, I think, on some of the transformers that I've seen online. But nonetheless, it does provide this isolation. Notice once again, the output is not electrically connected to the input. Now, you may ask, well, why go to all this trouble? Well, it's always difficult when making videos to know where to start and when to stop. Because even though I have made over 150 YouTube videos, and I have probably stressed this point, I don't know, 30, 40 videos, maybe 2 or 3 times per video, so well over 100 times. Sometimes people miss those. They don't really understand what I'm talking about. Sometimes I'm not very clear about what I'm talking about. But one lesson, if you take anything out of this video, it is if you do not understand electricity, if you have not received good safety training in electricity, it's best to avoid it because it can kill you. Now, I usually recommend that people get a mentor, someone with a lot of experience with electrical appliances, electrical work. Generally, I recommend an amateur radio operator through your local amateur radio club. But anyway, a mentor to help you if you are not trained on electronics. Before you start any electronic project that plugs into the AC line. Now, you can get a nasty shock off things that are powered just off a little 9-volt battery. But in general, those systems are safer than the systems plugged into the AC line. Anything plugged into the AC line without isolation is potentially lethal. So if I have come down pretty heavy on this, it's because I'm trying to save your life or the life of a friend of yours that watches you do something and then goes off and thinks they're doing the same thing. Pass this on. If you don't understand isolation, if you aren't certain that you are using an isolation transformer, it's best to simply avoid working on this kind of equipment. I realize that safety videos aren't very popular, so I'm not going to claim that you are going to enjoy this one. But for heaven's sakes, try to pass the word on to people who are not using isolation transformers that they are putting their life at risk, and they're putting those people who watch them at risk because they're passing on bad habits. Use an isolation transformer. If you use an isolation transformer, you can still get shocked. There are still potentially lethal voltages, particularly in some high voltage equipment. But at least you have a reasonable chance of enjoying the hobby without coming to a bad end. So I hope that you've gotten something out of this video. More than that, I hope you'll pass on this message to anyone else that you work with or influence in any way to understand what you're doing and use an isolation transformer anytime you're working on a piece of equipment powered from the AC line.